Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Baswell webinar, Baswell England webinar on social work in disasters. This is the full title is Social Work in Times of Disasters, a Green Social Work Perspective. My name is Gavin Morgan. I'm a professional officer for Baswell England, and I'm joined by Lena Dominelli, the Chair of Social Work at the University of Stirling and Chair of the Disaster Interventions, Climate Change and Sustainability Committee via the International Association of Schools of Social Work. It's a bit of a mouthful, I know. So Lena, welcome.
Thank you.
And Lena's going to be talking about this issue. Just so you all know, we have an ongoing Baswell takes an ongoing interest in the role of social workers in disasters, and there's various pieces of work going on which we will cover during the course of this webinar, and there's opportunities for members and social workers generally to get involved in this piece of work. You will see, this is a pre-recorded webinar, and you will see there are options to give feedback to us. Now there's an email you'll see at the end to send any questions directly in to us, but what I'd like to ask is, during the course of this webinar, please do have a think about these three particular areas. One is, do you feel ready to respond if you are called to respond to a disaster as a social worker? Two is, do you feel that your colleagues will be ready to respond to a disaster if required? And finally, what do you think social workers need in terms of the skill set to be responding to as a social worker in a time of disaster? So have a think of those. As I said, there should be a box available for you to submit those comments, and we will look at those later on. But that's enough from me. I'm going to pass you over to Lena now. Lena?
Thank you, Gavin. It's a real pleasure to be here, and hello, everyone. I'm really interested in talking to you about social work in times of disasters, because I think it's really crucial that we actually understand that there is a role for social workers in disaster situations. And given that we're recording this currently as hurricane, storm, however you want to describe it, Dennis has inundated so much of the UK, Wales, Scotland, England, parts of Northern Ireland, with floods, and devastated the lives of so many people. We've actually had casualties, which is quite unusual for the UK. So to me, sitting and watching what was going on, especially in the West Midlands yesterday afternoon, I was thinking, what is the role for social workers in this? And so I hope that by taking part in this webinar, some of you will get ideas about what you can do, because there is a very important role for us, not just in the immediate relief and recovery period, but also in reconstruction. So I hope that through this webinar, you'll learn some of the knowledge, the skills, and the issues that you have to deal with. And this webinar is based on research that I have been doing since 2009 in all sorts of different situations, floods and extreme weather events, including cold snaps and heat waves in the UK, earthquakes in other parts of the world, volcanoes, droughts, and so on. So it is based on research, but I'm not going to bore you with a lot of details about my research, like here's the research method and issues like that, not because they're not important, but because I think the message I want to get across today to you is that there is a very important role for you to play in interventions involving disasters in this country and elsewhere if you choose to go overseas. So here we go. I'm going to start. My starting point is that we are in the 21st century, and we are facing challenges that are brought about by a world of uncertainty and constant flux. And this makes it really, really challenging for us, because people normally like to know exactly what they need to do. And in the world that we're in, there is no certitude. We have to deal with constant uncertainty and flux. So we know some things for sure, and other things are less certain. The one thing that we know for sure, according to the science, is that disasters will increase in intensity, frequency, and damage. And this will mean that people will lose lives. We know that 2 people lost lives in Storm Ciara a few days ago, and 2 more have lost their lives here in the UK through Storm Dennis. So people's lives are at stake, their livelihoods are at stake, and their housing, their sense of community and belonging are at stake. So that makes it really important for us as social workers, because we're here to develop people's well-being and make sure that they actually are living life to their fullest capacity. Another reason we have to deal with this issue is that our professional identity is involved in looking for how we can do more social work in areas that we traditionally have been involved in, but no one recognizes it. And disaster interventions is one of that. So we need to have a strong professional voice that says, we are there at the table in disaster situations. The other reason, I think, is because it's really important. Disaster interventions are really linked to people's sense of building relationships with others. And this, to me, is a good antidote to a lot of social work in the UK, which currently is based on the new managerialism and is techno-bureaucratic in its orientation instead of being based on relationship building. So we need to get back to that, and disaster interventions offer us a way of doing that, because if you don't develop relationships with people and have a good trusting relationships with them, then you're not going to get very far. The other reason is that, believe it or not, economic inequalities, which we stand against in social work, rear their ugly head in a disaster situation too. And we know that within the UK and globally, the people who are affected most by disasters are poor people. So for us in the UK, it becomes really important, because with austerity cutting back on a lot of the services that social local authority and social services have provided traditionally, we are having to cut back. So this provides us with data and ammunition for saying, hang on, people who are going to suffer most from this and who will find it difficult to recover, like rebuild their houses when they've been damaged by floods, are people who haven't got insurance and who are poor. Okay, so that's another reason. And then I think, and it breaks my heart to say this, we do have ineffective international institutions. The UN is our strongest international institution, but we have so many countries, including the superpowers, the US, China. I don't know whether people see Russia as a superpower. It certainly sees itself as one. But all the new and emerging and growing economies that want to be in that position, from Brazil to Mexico to Indonesia, are challenging the remit that held sway for quite a while, where people had a consensus that said, states should be involved in making life better for everyone across the globe. Now, I am finding, certainly through attending the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and I've been representing social workers in these since 2010, that it's national self-interest that is the guiding principle. And that is going to be totally ineffective if we have things that are going to follow climate change, which most social workers haven't even begun to think about. For example, climate change refugees. There is not a single piece of international legislation that covers them. So we have nothing that we have to do for them. But we should be. As social workers, we want to do things for them. But where's our international institutions and regulations that will help us do that? We have to invent them. We have to create them. The other thing, and you know, here in the UK, I think we have a democratic deficit, as there is everywhere in the world, where so many voices are silenced. Like we do here now, oh, Brexit. The majority of the population voted for Brexit. Okay, but what about the 48% that didn't? What about the 66% that didn't vote for Boris Johnson? What about the fact that we have a prime minister that was never elected by anyone except a small minority of the Conservative Party? All of these disenfranchised people who then feel left out, the people who say, oh, we've been left behind. But it's our own democratic institutions that have left people behind. And we know this as social worker because we have to fight with the twins of austerity and the lack of voice. And that's what makes up this democratic deficit for virtually all of the people we work with when we're trying to provide services for them. Then within the global arena, there's neocolonialism. And whether we like it or not, because it really goes against the grain of social work, there are neocolonial relationships that are being set up, including through the use of education, which is primarily Western oriented and is imposed in some cases on other countries. That is not the way to go. I mentioned mass migration in relation to climate change refugees, which can vary from 250 million, which is the conservative UN estimate, to 1 billion, which is what some other people estimate. But we have mass migration from armed conflict, like Syria, for example, and many other reasons. And a lot of these people are just wanting to have a safe space in which to live. So we're going to have to think differently about what migration means. That's another huge challenge for us. Then we're being challenged, and again, this links up nicely with climate change, by Indigenous worldviews, because Indigenous people in the global South, in Canada, the First Nations there, the Native Americans in the US, the Maori in New Zealand, the Aboriginal people in Australia, the Aboriginal people in Latin America have been saying, you know what, we have to take care of planet Earth. Otherwise, we are going to be in a mess. We are custodians of planet Earth, not there to exploit it for the means of making money. That is not what the Earth was there for. It's to meet our needs, but we should meet our needs thinking about how do other people in the future and other plants and animals and the Earth itself survive are meeting our needs today. And I like the First Nations Canadian view, which is that whenever you live your life, you should never leave a footprint that somebody else can see. And I think that makes it so vivid for me. That's what we should be doing. Then as social workers interested in working with people in anti-oppressive, empowering ways, then we should be looking at locality-specific, culturally relevant practice. And that means that we constantly have to ask people locally, the people we work with, whether it's one-to-one, in groups or communities, what do they really need to meet their needs? And how do we work with them to make sure that we fulfill that and still remain true to the laws that we have to abide by and the regulations that we need to fulfill? And how do we challenge those regulations when we think they're not appropriate, they're not fit for purpose? So that's the challenge there. And then we do have controversies about values, especially around equalities and diversities. And, you know, we've just had, unbelievably, in the UK in 2020, one special advisor to the Prime Minister who had to be sacked because he was using language and abusive language that really stems from the 1920s. And I think, you know, this is 80 years later, you're still using that when we've had 40 years of being told otherwise. Anyway, so that's still there, sadly. Then we have user involvement, and this is so crucial. I believe that social work needs to be engaged with people in what I call co-production, because that's how we treat them as equals. It's not that we don't have expertise and knowledge that the service users don't have, we do. We also have power they don't have, but they also have knowledge and power that we have to respect and learn how to combine with our expert knowledge and their kind of locally, culturally specific knowledges. The other thing that, of course, is quite big and much bigger than any individual social worker is the issue of globalization, privatization, and outsourcing. These are all linked together because in our society today, in a neoliberal world, it is business that has the biggest voice. Business, I think, should be at the table, but it should not have the biggest voice. It should be one voice amongst many. And we need to hold business accountable for the decisions they make. And really important in this situation, because a lot of our disasters are because they have been unaccountable for over a century for the decisions they make. Like, for example, the use of fossil fuels. Now, intrinsically, fossil fuels in themselves aren't a danger to society. It's the fact that we throw everything out into the atmosphere, into the water, and into the soil because it's the cheapest way of doing it. They could have cleaned up their act right at the very beginning. And I remember even thinking this as a teenager. I was an activist teenager, I hasten to add, sort of wondering why in Canada on the West Coast where I was living at the time, all these industries were just throwing everything out into the air. And you looked at the Vancouver area, which has an inversion layer, and you could see all the smog kind of sitting on top of the city. It was completely unnecessary, but it was cheaper to do that. And because they weren't held accountable, they did it and got away with it. Now we have to start demanding accountability, clean up their acts. They can recycle most of the materials that they throw out into planet Earth. So that's very important. The other issue is that, as I said at the very beginning, disasters are increasing in intensity and ferocity because of what we've done to planet Earth. And some people will argue all disasters are human-made, they're not natural. And I say, well, they might have been natural hazards like earthquakes and volcanoes, but they are only turned into disasters because of the interface between a hazard and what people then do in relation to that hazard, either by ignoring it, which is most often the case, not taking action that mitigates the impact of that on their lives and so on. So there is something there for us to really explore as social workers in the micro level as well as at the micro level through our practice. And then there's what I call manufactured, in quotes, resource scarcities. This says that, you know, everything is in scarce supply and therefore we have to ration. And that to me is true and false at the same time, which is why I call it manufactured. Because technically we have all the resources there are on planet Earth. We're not going to get any more, not in a hurry. So the resources that we need to lead our lives are there. It's the distribution of those resources that is unequal and that produces the scarcities. And that's why I call it manufactured scarcity, because we could redistribute them in a more egalitarian way. But if social workers don't make that message known loud and clear, nobody else is going to, because nobody else sees what happens through the unequal distribution of resources except as statistics. We see what it does to people's lives on a day-to-day basis. And then there are violent conflicts and insecurity. And actually, these are linked to resource scarcities, because most climate conflicts and conflicts over resources are because of the unequal distribution. And then people with greater power say, well, we want this amount and you have to make do with a lesser amount. So there's no discussion about how we share them equally so that we all get what we need, but nobody gets more than what they need or wastes what they don't need. And that leads to environmental abuse and degradation, because we treat the earth, the atmosphere, the soil, the waters as sinks, like we just dump everything into it. And we should not be doing that, because we should be taking care of our environment, not abusing it, using it with care and owing it what I call a duty of care to the environment. And I've been the first social worker, actually, as far as I know, the first researcher even to argue that that is one of our responsibilities as people. And I got the idea originally from First Nations in Canada that said we shouldn't be leaving a footprint when we use the Earth's resources. The other thing I have to say we need to do, and it's a challenge, is how do we include all these things in an overcrowded curriculum and in placements that actually don't exist to support social workers doing disaster interventions? I know I work with emergency managers and they keep saying, we need social workers to help us, but then nobody does anything to kind of like welcome social workers into their midst, and we don't ask to join them. We should be banging on the door saying, let us in, we're here. And then our values of social justice, equality, and inclusion are what we need to actually do good disaster social work interventions, because we know that growing inequalities and injustice are really a threat to the well-being of everyone. So that's why I think we need to do this. Okay, so I'm sorry I took a long time to talk about that, but I shall try to get a bit quicker. So the first thing I want to say is, what is a disaster? Because there are lots of definitions about this, and you can see from the slide that the UN argues that it's an event that exceeds the capacity of local people, individuals, that is, communities and organizations to cope, where you need external support. And the aim of that support is to mitigate risk and develop resilience against future disasters. So that makes our current flooding one really, really important in that regard, because local communities are saying we need help. That's why we declare it an emergency situation. And this is, as I said before, a disaster occurs when a hazard interacts with people and social institutions. And there are three key stages of disasters: immediate relief, recovery, and reconstruction. And I'll cover these as I go through the rest of the situation. And by the way, I should say all of these photographs that I use, unless I say otherwise, are photos that I've taken in my disaster research work. The types of disaster, I've said a hazard is what occurs as a danger or a threat. A disaster is the interaction between that hazard and what people do in response or lack of response to it. And what we do as individuals, communities, governments, is to do a risk assessment of hazards. Now, we are familiar as social workers with risk assessments. What we do in relation to a disaster is try to work out how threatening is this? How dangerous is it to us? So it's no different from that point of view. And natural disasters, as I said, occur when they interact with society, but it's usually things like earthquakes, volcanic actions, which really don't involve us very much. Although, did you know the UK has 10 earthquakes per year, but they're so small we don't notice them most of the time. Occasionally we do. Volcanic action we only notice when Iceland, like Yellowjoko Yellowfell, I say it quickly because my pronunciation is a little bit dodgy, affects us. And if Katya blows up, we'll be affected even more. Storm surges, we have those frequently now. They're becoming yearly. They didn't used to be. Tsunamis and hurricanes, we have less of, but we have hurricanes here occasionally. And human-made disasters, for us as social workers, they're really important. The number one that I have up there is poverty. That is the human-made disaster which poses us with the biggest challenge, because for the last 100 years we've been trying to deal with it and we still haven't eliminated it. So that's a challenge for us. Climate change and extreme weather events, I've said quite a bit about that, so I'll move on. Chemical spills, we also get involved when people are evacuated. When they're in place of safety, then that's when we come in. Armed conflict. Social workers are both in armed conflict and victim survivors of armed conflicts all over the world. And we have here in the UK, the armed conflict we had in Northern Ireland. And actually there's some really good materials that BASWA has produced on that, which I suggest you look at. Terrorism linked to armed conflict as well. air pollution, I've mentioned that before. Health pandemics. I'm just going to say something very briefly about the coronavirus at the moment, which is in danger of becoming a health pandemic. It hasn't quite reached the numbers to do that yet, but we need to be prepared in the UK because with our ease of communication, our many links to all over the place, internally and externally, we have to know how to look after ourselves in terms of looking after our health and well-being and making sure that diseases don't spread. And you'll notice the person who's wearing a mask in my pictures, that is Lakladek in India, and he's actually wearing it against air pollution. And I hate to tell him, there's so many things wrong with the way he's wearing it. First of all, the sides have got gaps, which means that the air pollution will come in. And secondly, the only mask that actually, I did research on this, that works effectively against air pollution because the small particulate matter of 2.5 microns is the N95 or FFP3. So remember that if you're involved in one of these pandemics, because that will protect you and others. This one will help to a certain extent. It's still good. It's better than nothing, but it's still, and the way he's wearing it is completely wrong. And the other thing is fires. Now, I've got a picture of a forest fire here, but also we know Grenfell fires, they're huge fires, and the danger of combustible cladding that we're aware of in the UK. So I had as the subtitle in this that I want to talk about social work perspectives and green social work perspectives in particular. And this is because I have developed green social work for particular reasons as a critique of ecological social work, which only focuses mainly on social institution, and environmental social work, which did not have a critique of industrial production. Green social work does have a critique of industrial production, and it's holistic. It looks at both the earth as a system that we interact with, and also the social institutions as systems we interact with. And also, green social work is transdisciplinary because we as social workers do not know all we need to know about disasters to be able to intervene effectively. So we have to work with physical scientists. And I'm very proud to say that I have been very privileged to work with them. And actually, it's really increased my awareness of disasters and how we as social workers can intervene by working with them in earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and also floods and droughts and so on. What we do, though, in green social work is to focus on the social organization of relationships between people and their interactions with flora, that's plants, fauna, animals in their physical habitats, because we create socio-economic situations that lead to physical environmental crises that undermine the well-being of ourselves and the planet itself. So that's why it's really important that we have that green perspective, because it's about saying, okay, if we're going to challenge the use of fossil fuels, what do we put in its place? And this is where renewable energies of many, many kinds, which I could do a whole webinar just on renewable energies from a social work perspective on another occasion. But it really gives us an insight into the environmental and human-induced hazards. So we're different because we argue for the recognition of interdependence among all living things on Earth. That's why I've got the Earth in that circle there, and I have to acknowledge that's one of the icons that I devised a little bit differently from IFSW, which you'll all be familiar with as BASWA members. And then we also look at sustainable relationships among peoples, because we all need different things in different parts of the world, other living things than the inanimate world, like our physical environment, our communities, the mountains, the rivers, the lakes, the air, and planet Earth itself. We need to sustain this climate, which we're in danger of losing if it fries as will happen if we don't take care of climate change. So I talk about a reciprocated duty to care for and about everyone and everything. So I am responsible to you for what I do, and you're responsible to me for what you do. Not just to me, and to other people around you, but to the planet itself and to everything contained within our beautiful planet Earth. And the other thing is a transdisciplinarity that involves sciences, professions, businesses, local communities, residents, and we have to share our knowledges, whether it's expert scientific knowledge or local cultural knowledge. And together, we have to co-produce and plan our actions together, not separately and individually. Otherwise, we'll miss the real plot. Now, I've tried to say all of this in a very simple way in this chart that I've developed. I call it Empowering Green Social Work Practice. And it tackles the oppression of people and degradation of the environment because, as far as I'm concerned, green social work argues we are oppressing the environment by what we're doing to it. And it's our neoliberal system which produces not just austerity vis-a-vis people, but also the degradation of the environment in its wake because of the way we misuse our resources. And we need the knowledge and skills to be able to provide a critique of that, because otherwise it's just, well, that's what you think. But we need the physical science data, the empirical data, and the microdata that we as social workers have par excellence. And then, of course, that this deals and takes advantage of our anti-oppressive values and commitment to human rights, both individually and collectively. It's about tackling resource and structural inequalities because we know what it does to people in their day-to-day lives. And tackling environmental degradation, which we are very poor at as social workers. So this is where green social work is saying, don't treat it as something out there that other people do. It's what we do as really crucial to our day-to-day social work. And then I've decided to kind of look at, well, what do we do during the different parts of the disaster cycle? So in this slide, you'll see I've tried to kind of like highlight the three key elements of the disaster cycle: immediate relief, which we often do in an evacuation center, recovery and reconstruction. And on the other side, I've got the tasks that we do in each of these parts of the cycle. But actually, a lot of that continues all the way through. So I should have really put an arrow that goes both ways, but I didn't when I thought about this. But I can see it now. I should be including that arrow down there. So just imagine this virtual arrow where all the dots are, joining all the dots together. But we do focus on specific elements, which I highlight by the different colors. So for immediate relief, which we do when people have been evacuated, because the evacuation is actually done by the military, the police, and firefighters, by and large. And we're there to receive people in their shelters when they get there, and we provide practical assistance, and most of it is in the form of food, water, clothing, medicines, and shelter itself. Often this can mean trying to get people either relocated back in their own houses if they're fit for purpose once the disaster has ended, or to find alternative accommodation for them. The other thing we do, and it usually starts immediately because people are so worried about family that they've lost contact with because of the disaster, and believe it or not, pet reunification. It is so important to people. I remember the first time I mentioned this in an emergency planner meeting, they were kind of shocked and said, well, is that why people tell us they're not leaving until they find their cat or their dog? I said, yes, because those pets are family to them and they mean so much. It's the significance, which we understand as social worker, of those pets, which the emergency planners have been trained to do. And the other thing we offer is emotional support. Now, a lot of people think, oh, that's only for PSTD, but no, it's not for disaster stress syndromes. It's actually there at the very beginning. People feel completely at loss. They don't know what to do. They need encouragement and building up their confidence, that kind of emotional support right away. And then we get to the more kind of clinical psychosocial interventions later. And for some people, that psychosocial support doesn't happen for 1 or 2 years after the disaster because they're not ready for it. If you offer it too early, they will just ignore it. So that's the immediate relief. Then recovery. Now, I have to add that as we go down these stages of disaster, social work intervention gets less and less because most people, which is what the critique green social work offers, decided, oh, well, we've done our job now that everybody's safely relocated either back home or somewhere else. But actually we haven't. There is still lots of other things that we need to do. So in recovery, which sometimes starts immediately during the immediate relief period, and one of these is cleanups. And as social workers, we can be volunteers in that cleanup. And I will remember when I first started on this back in 2004 in the Indian Ocean tsunami, and we were taking social workers, I hasten to add, not from the UK, to the sites. And one social work student said to me, why am I being asked to clean up the debris? And I looked at him and I said, ask me that at the end of the day. Meanwhile, just go and do what you're told for a change. You know, I don't often say that to social work students, but I did on that occasion. So I waited, and finally at the end of the day, he comes up to me and he says, I know why you said that now. I said, do you? Good. Why? And he said, because I really learned a lot about these people's lives by helping them clean up the debris. And I said, yes, that's exactly. It's a relationship building, breaking the ice exercise, but I didn't want to tell you that. You have to find out for yourself. So very important, but really ignored by most social workers. The other stuff that becomes increasingly important is loss and grief support. People actually, and it's really interesting. Do you know, I was quite surprised in my early days in this work that the thing that people missed most about, this was in earthquake situations, everything's destroyed in an instant by debris collapsing and burying stuff. They missed the photographs. And it was really quite, you know, like I now call them artifacts of everyday life, but they really missed, you know, that was the only photo I had of my grandma. I remember one person telling me, and I don't have it anymore. And my memory isn't what it used to be. And now I can sympathize with that loss because I know my memory isn't as good as it used to be. And I think, yes, those artifacts are really important in maintaining connections between the past, present, and the future, because she had wanted to pass that down to her children. Now she cannot. So if you have pictures, make sure they're on some server that's not in a disaster area. And the other one is psychosocial and emotional support. People become ready to receive this psychosocial intervention when they suddenly, it hits them all of a sudden, oh my God, I've lost all this. And it's not going to come back. And I can't do that. And I can't do this. That's when they're ready. And they will come to you and say, you know, you offered me this a long time ago, but now I'm ready. And the Chinese that I worked with in the Wenchuan earthquake aftermath of that said, stay away from fire, dogs, and psychotherapists. And that was their saying, kind of like, Gus, go away, because there were so many psychosocial therapists that descended on them. And the last thing they wanted was any of this. But a year and 2 years later, they came and they said, now we're ready. Can you offer it to us now? Yeah, which was really interesting. And then reconstruction. Now, very few social workers are involved here, except for the community development workers. And this is where I have to confess that I came into social work originally as a community worker, community development worker, social development worker, and my heart is still there. So I've been doing a lot of this, but it is so rare. And in my research, it's kind of like maybe 1% of social workers get involved in this at this later stage. And this is about rebuilding communities. But I always think the thing that gets ignored by the community development workers quite a bit, especially at the individual level. They're okay relating at the community level, but we need people to build their relationships at the individual, the family, the group, and community levels. And that's what we are good at. And we need to be proud of the things that we're good at and get out there and do them instead of saying, oh, somebody else is going to do them. They're not. And then the other thing that I think we offer a critique is building back better. And I think, well, what does that mean? Because in a lot of poor communities, I don't want to build them back better. I want to build them back differently, more egalitarian. So I keep, that's why it's in quotes, because I keep critiquing that, never getting anywhere, not in the UN circles that I interact with. But you can see the UN, that's me. I've forgotten where I took that. I think that might be Paris. But, you know, I take so many of these pictures that I forget, thousands of them, I hasten to add. But I put the SDGs there too, because I want to encourage us as social workers to take advantage of all of them. We tend to focus on number one, which is eliminating poverty. Number two, which is eliminating hunger, and also number five, which is about gender equality. But all of them, we have a specific and wonderful input to put in. And even in 17, which we tend to ignore, but we do it all the time, that's about building partnerships. Okay, it says a global partnership, but you know, we do that too as social workers. So every single one of them, and again, I can come back another time and do a webinar on the SDGs and what social workers can do. But we need to, because those things help us in building strategies of prevention, mitigation, and adaptation. We have to prevent disasters, one, because otherwise we'll constantly be doing what we're doing, as we heard on the television in relation to, say, Hebden Bridge after Cara. This is the second time in kind of like a couple of years that they're flooded out. We shouldn't be doing that. If we focused on prevention and not just adaptation or mitigation, we might have gone better. And social workers are always banging on about prevention, prevention, prevention. Nobody hears us and nobody gives us the resources to do it, but we still need to make that message very clear. Mitigation is useful because it enables us to assess the risk. But adaptation, and I worry about adaptation in relation to climate change, because if we stop at adaptation only, we will never do the preventative work, which means we will never reach this 1.5 degrees increase, centigrade that is, increase in temperatures that will keep us at a safe level so that we don't all fry at some point or other, or that we, in places like Canada, Northern Europe, Siberia, Northern China, all up in the Northern Hemisphere, all those places there, everybody will be migrating northwards because it'll be the only place, but that will be contributing to the global warming, because what happens in those places is greenhouse gases take a more virulent form because it's methane gas, which is produced there, and it is 25 times worse than CO2, which is carbon dioxide. So that will make it even worse. So we don't want to do that. So we have to keep the melting of the Antarctic and the Arctic ice flows down, eliminated completely. The other thing that we have to do that we are good at, because we actually recognize resilience as people's capacity actually to learn from their past experience to do things better, not just in the traditional way, but also learn from it and do things differently. And that has to happen at both the personal and community level. And then we have to argue for sustainable solutions, especially in housing. You know, when I was at Durham University, I always used to say, because we used to get floods on the River Wear virtually every year, you know what? We should be building houses, buildings that are facing the river, if we're going to build on the floodplains, on stilts. Then the water can just wash through, and whilst we've got the buildings on arches and lift them up a floor, we can park underneath them, which will protect some of our green spaces. And if we pave it with permeable bricks, we will also be able to let the water flow through down to the aquifers. So eventually, after many years, they did listen to me and they said they're going to do it, but I haven't seen them doing it yet. I'm still living in Durham. So we need sustainable solutions. So we either don't build in floodplains, or we build houses that can cope with the floods that are going to happen, and they're going to happen increasingly. The other thing that we have to do, and we used to be really good at this, was grief and loss support. And we used to be trained in this. But guess what? Because of the way our new training since 2003 has gone, most of that is out of most of people's curriculum. And if you're lucky, you'll get one lecture or one workshop, and you've got to learn a whole semester's worth in 1 or 2 hours. And then the other thing, which I think is really, really important, and again, it has to go all the way through these things, is building hope for the future. We have to build hope and keep that hope going, because that is what allows us to think differently about our future. Anyway, I'm getting the signal that I've got to speed up a lot more now. So maybe I just have to show you a lot of these pictures. The roles for social workers, well, I've already talked about being an assessor. We have to coordinate the delivery of services and goods. I've talked about family support and community reconstruction. We have to advocate for communities and lobby. We have to mobilize them and be seen as change agents, which we've said that's what we always were. At least they did when I trained as a social worker. And we're gatekeepers of resources. So, we're still using that. And then focus on our prevention and resisting the continuation of structural inequalities and environmental degradation. And then do some social development work, which enables us to co-develop different models for socio-economic development. And that includes involving all stakeholders in that process. And then enhancing the well-being of people, other living things, and planet Earth. I've said that so many times. Now this, I've talked about this when I went through the tasks, but I really like this chart because it really explains what the social work tasks are. And I did adapt this from Hobson and Adams, who had it for migration, and they had all sorts of wonderful things like the honeymoon period, and I've forgotten all the other things. So I've developed this for disasters. So it's really good because if you don't know what to do, focus on this and it will give you very clear ideas. And then I just highlight on the right-hand side, as you go towards prevention, the response to the crisis can be giving up or leaving. So not necessarily resilience. Partial recovery is also something. Accepting it and say there's nothing I can do, but I will just cope, which is why coping is not enough. And then going to new confidence and building something new and different. That's where we want to be. And that's at the renewal transformative stage, right at the very top. And then community engagement processes and practices. Well, we are really good at this because there is nothing there except maybe community development profile that you don't know about as a social worker. This is generic skills, basically, taking us through from risk assessment to mitigation planning to action planning, to implementation of action plans. I've got an earthquake there as a disaster, but it could be a flood. It could be any disaster. And then action plan evaluation. And the reason why I put earthquake there was because I was going to challenge you with some new and different things. But since we got about 15 minutes left, I won't go into that for now. We can have another webinar. See, we've got lots of webinars we could do. But I do want to highlight that we are good at two-way communication with our service users. And we're also good at community engagement and co-production. So that's why this is at the heart of green social work. And I would say use it because you have most of the skills you need already, and the ones that you don't have, you bring in experts to help you do that. Okay. Then self-care. Oh my God. We are terrible at doing this as social workers, and I have to plead guilty to that. I'm surprised, and some of my colleagues will tell me, I'm surprised you're not burnt out already. But I just, as long as I'm on adrenaline, I keep going. But it's not good. So don't do that. So self-care is really, really important. And why it's important is to address the stresses of the emotionality that really, really hits you in this work. And I can say, maybe because of my Italian heritage, although I don't know much about Italy, I am emotional and I do respond to people's tears. And so there have been times, and I've been thinking, oh my God, we were trained not to hug people when we are crying together, but we do in disasters, because it's really important to say to them, we're in this together. And it's not abusive, and they know it's not abusive, and I know it's not abusive, because we know what constitutes abusement. And that's when we're trying to put power over others and getting them to do what we're trying to do, not to let them say what they're wanting to do. The other reason is that to work effectively and to give and receive support, that receiving support is really important. And I have to say, I think I'm pretty good at that, because I often say to people, why are you giving me the best bed to sleep in? I don't need that. Give it to this older person or someone else, not to me. And the third reason, which we should know about because it happens in ordinary practice, is to avoid professional burnout. We can burn out very, very easily in disaster situations because they're very complex. You have to juggle lots of different balls at any one point in time. And so you need to worry about that. And if you are going to volunteer to go to an area outside of your own locality, make sure that you prepare yourself and your family members or community groups or whatever you've been involved with before you go. You've got to sort of say to them, I'm not going because I'm going to be there, number one. Number two, we don't think about this very often either, unless you've been burgled like I have, then you do. Deal with things like milk if you have it delivered to your doorstep, like some people are doing now, newspapers, health insurance, house insurance, all of those things need to be dealt with. And inform yourself about local customs and cultural differences. If you don't know the language, get an interpreter and know that it's someone you can trust and work with almost before you go there. So I have well-trusted ones that I use in China, for example, because I go there so much. Then when you're on the spot, do ask about daily debriefing, because you won't get it otherwise, and peer support. Use your peers, support them, and they'll support you too. And get some supervision on the ground, because you can talk to each other after the day is done, wherever you are, to try and get some of this support. And also equally important is arrange for regular report back to and supervision from your home base, and get your manager to start thinking differently about the work you're doing, not sort of say, oh, somebody else will take care of you until you come back. No, you need their care while you're away too. And then when you come back, we often think, oh God, the job, I got to get back to the day job and the piles that are there waiting for you, because most of us do not get replacement workers when we're gone. You will still need debriefing, support, and supervision about what you've been doing outside of the day job somewhere else in this disaster area. Also, if you can, have a holiday. That is really good therapeutic intervention on your own behalf. And also some of the people, and I know I've talked to so many social workers who've been involved in disasters from 9/11 to Dunblane, to terrorist attacks in London, to Lockerbie. And even though in the cases of some, it's decades later, they're still experiencing trauma. So please, please get counseling if you need it. There is nothing wrong with getting help and support. And if you are in a post-traumatic stress disorder situation, get help for that, because you will not be an effective social worker if you're not looking after yourself. And I've got some wonderful things there. Some things are therapeutic in themselves. And in China, dancing is one of those things that are really, really helpful. And we always danced, we cried together and danced together and did lots of things together, ate together. Eating together is really, really important. So that's sort of situations there to show you. And then also some good examples of good development. Now that top picture is the Erasmus community. Sorry, not the Erasmus community, the disability community just outside of Pretoria. And this is a community, they were given a plot of land and they were told to do what they'd like to do. This is all disabled people with 2 social workers supporting them. And they developed their own garden. They're self-sustainable in food production. They're self-sustainable in lots of income generation. Some of the jewelry I wear is from them. Lots of things that they do. So this is just a lovely, and it's outside kind of Pretoria, which has lots of slums as well as beautiful areas. So I show this here because I think we need to think more about the environment as part of our therapeutic interventions. And that's how this started off. It was a therapeutic intervention to empower disabled people. And it ended up doing green social work, which is fantastic as far as I'm concerned. And then I think we need to also think about training, specific training. Now, I have offered 2 short courses to social workers, one in Durham for all of English social workers, English in the people who live in England, and another one to Scottish in the sense of all people who live in Scotland, although we had a person from Nigeria join us in Scotland, because I can never say no to anybody wanting to come. And even though we capped the numbers, they exceeded the numbers by a large proportion. And I was happy about that because I think the more and more of us are interested in this, the better. But what I've put up here is what I'm working on for a 1-year MSc in disaster interventions and humanitarian aid, which I'm going to call disaster action for short. And people can come to this and finish off at different pathways with a PG certificate, a diploma, and an MSc. And the things, the courses, the modules that we teach will be 1 in humanitarian aid to understand the history of why we're doing that. We've been doing this for over 100 years since we started as a profession. Why our values and ethics are absolutely fundamental to this work. Then theories of concepts about humanitarian aid and emergencies. Again, we're familiar with this: risk, vulnerability, resilience, sustainability. We talk about this in social work. Then about disaster definitions, the stages, the strategies of intervention, what the different terms mean, how we can relate to these transdisciplinary people who come to join us in a partnership. And then there will be field-based learning opportunities where we learn about how to do social work, but mainly observing in the first instance. There's also communication skills and media interactions. Now, this is really important. It also came as a recommendation. Most of these are based on recommendations that came out of these 2 courses that I mentioned. And media interactions are really important because if you listen, and even today, if you listen to the media coverage on the floods that we have here in the UK, where's the social work voice? Not one social worker has spoken that I've heard, and I've tried to listen to as much of it as I could, including on the radio while I was even producing this set of slides and so on. The other things that are really important, and most social workers groan when you mention research methods, but they're really exciting because this validates what we know through tacit knowledge and experience, because we then get the empirical evidence to say what we know anyway. So there's a dissertation based on that, and the research methods and the dissertation go together. And then I also offer 2 continuing professional education modules, which you can trade in for humanitarian aid and social and environmental justice. And this is the social dimensions of disasters. And these we hope will be offered in June for people who want to come, and disaster interventions from green social work perspective. So you get, if you take the 2, and these will be offered as a 3-day residential, we think. That means people can obtain them on the cheap and then trade them in for 40 credits. So that means you only have to do, if you want just a PG certificate, one of the other tips on that. And those are me teaching and training in China. This is teaching and training in Sri Lanka. And so we're now in the conclusions, and I think we've got a few more minutes left. Yeah. So we'll probably finish on time, hopefully. And I wanted to conclude with sort of saying, you know what, we need a vision for social work in disasters or in times of disasters. I don't like the term disaster social work, mainly because I think the media will have a field day talking about us being the disasters rather than about the great work we do. And I have to say that the social workers I have worked with, and a lot of volunteers too, do extremely wonderful social work, even though they don't call themselves social workers. Most of them, they call themselves humanitarian aid workers, but they're doing social work. I keep telling them that too. But we already have a head start because the values that are important in this, inclusivity, social justice, including environmental justice, which green social work introduced to the social justice debate. Before, environmental justice used to be seen as a thing on its own, and it's not. It's part of social justice because of the structural inequalities that underpin environmental injustice. Then equality, we cannot do anything, I think, in social work, whatever setting we're in, without equality being there at the forefront of what we're trying to do and treating people as equal so that we can learn from their knowledge and experiences. Engaging with them. This is where active listening, but also doing things together. It's not just about, okay, I've heard you and I'll go away and do something else, but I've heard you and now we're going to do this together because together we'll make a better difference. And empowering people. You know, I remember the late Michael Oliver saying, social workers can only disempower people. I always disagreed with him and still do. We can empower people, but that's about how we work with them and what our end product is. It means we have to have joint and common objectives, joint ways of working, joint ways of proceeding together. And then we can empower people. They empower us and we help empower them and we empower each other. That's the way I see it. And then that ends up with co-production, because at the end of the day, if we co-produce things together, we will both feel we own it. It's not something that's imposed on you. We've developed it together, so it's ours, not mine, not yours. And then I think we also need to argue that social services, including social care, is a universal right. And that means then we can get into this reciprocated social caring to care about ourselves, about others, be cared for by others, and planet Earth. That's where it comes in for me. And then for me, the philosophy, some people might say it's political. I don't see it as political. I just see it as good, inclusive practice. We have to be social democratic. Why the social in there? Because we're social workers. We deal with the social. Now, this can be interpreted as what's happening in the Nordic countries where they have social democracies. And there are good guides. They provide good guidance for us, so use it. But I'm talking about social democratic philosophies that are about being inclusive and engaging people as equals. And then participation in co-production. You cannot get involved in disaster interventions because you know what? If you just tell people what to do, they'll do things while you're there. And the minute you leave, and I hate to tell you this, most NGOs leave disaster areas within 3 to 6 months. 80% of them leave within that period, according to my research. So the minute they leave, that's it. There's no funding to carry on. There's nothing. But whereas if you co-produce and involve people, they will continue it because they've already invested a lot of time and energy and it's theirs as much as yours. So that's why it's important. And then do think about the 21st century challenges. Yes, our old challenges like poverty are still there, but we have new ones that we have to face, including climate change. And then never, ever forget that practice is both relationship-based and addresses structural inequalities. We have to deal with the person and structures that we are surrounded with in our practice, in our everyday lives. And I think that this is a wonderful way to conclude, to say you have all the knowledge, skills, that you need at your disposal. You just need to apply them in a different setting and get help for where you need it and look after yourself. And self-care, really important. And before I say thank you for listening, I want to invite you all to a meeting that we are having here in Baswa, Birmingham, Baswa, England, is a meeting of the Special Interest Group for Disaster Interventions, shortened to SPEDI, S-P-E-D-I, which I am privileged enough to be chairing at the moment. And come and join us, because we're going to do wonderful things together for the UK as a whole and for our 4 individual nations, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So thank you so much for listening to me, and do ask questions, and Gavin's going to tell you how you do that. Gavin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lena. That was really, really helpful. I thinking right at the beginning of that presentation, you talked about disasters increasing in intensity and damage, which obviously is a concern. And it comes back to what you were saying. You know, we have the skill set. We just need to know how to apply it. And so it comes back to that question: do you feel ready as social workers out there? And if you're the leader of social workers, do you feel confident that you know what to do in terms of responding? And if there's we really want people to get in touch with us, whether it's directly through Lena or whether it's through the BASRA website. You can contact us via email, you can call us, and there's an opportunity to get involved in some of the great work we're doing, including this meeting that Lena's just referred to in April. So please do get in touch, have a look at the website, and thank you very much for joining this webinar. Lena, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Bye.